Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my commentary. Today, no one expected the global economic order to rupture on a quiet morning. There was no emergency summit, no warning leaks, no visible countdown to crisis, and yet, that is precisely what happened when Donald Trump announced that South Africa would not be invited to the 2026 G20 summit in Miami. In a single moment, an assumption that had guided global cooperation for nearly 2 decades was violently overturned. This was not a routine policy update, and it was certainly not a minor diplomatic disagreement. It was a political detonation, the kind of detonation that does not merely anger governments, but destabilizes institutions, the kind that forces capitals around the world to reassess which rules still matter and which ones can be discarded at will. What made the shock so severe was not just the decision itself, but the realization that something previously considered untouchable had suddenly become negotiable. For almost 20 years, the G20 rested on a silent but sacred principle. Once a country entered, its membership was not conditional. That principle was never carved into stone or written into a binding treaty, but it was universally respected. It was the glue that held together a forum designed to bridge the global north and the global south. With one declaration, Trump shattered that unwritten covenant. The message from Washington was unmistakable and brutally clear. The United States was now prepared to weaponize the very foundations of global governance. The reaction was immediate and global. Shockwaves rippled through Berlin, New Delhi, Brasília, and Beijing. Analysts were not arguing about whether Trump had gone too far. They were asking something far more consequential. If this precedent stands, can the G20 itself survive? Because once a rule like this is broken, it cannot simply be repaired. The international system does not reset. It adapts, often in ways that make it more fragmented, more hostile, and more unstable. What made this moment truly historic was not only the exclusion of South Africa, but the signal embedded within it. If Washington can unilaterally remove a country from the G20, then global cooperation is no longer genuinely multilateral. It becomes conditional. Conditional on ideology, conditional on political alignment, conditional on whether a nation conforms to U.S. narratives. This was not just a breach of protocol. It was a warning shot aimed directly at the global south. Remain compliant, or risk being erased from the world's most powerful economic table. In that instant, the illusion of a neutral and stable G20 collapsed. The world was pushed into a new era, one in which institutions designed to unify nations could now be repurposed to discipline them. If the decision to exclude South Africa was the explosion, then Trump's justification for doing so was the accelerant that transformed a diplomatic crisis into a global inferno. With a single post on Truth Social, Trump accused South Africa of committing horrific human rights violations. This was not neutral language. It carried a long and deeply toxic history. For years, fringe groups and hardliner commentators had promoted narratives of racial warfare in South Africa. But never before had such claims been elevated to the level of official U.S. presidential doctrine. In international politics, language like this does not merely describe a problem, it creates an enemy. And the enemy Trump constructed was not a specific administration or policy, it was an entire nation, accused wholesale of racial violence across Africa. Diplomats interpreted the statement as a deliberate provocation, carefully engineered to damage Pretoria's global legitimacy. Human rights organizations warned that such framing risked inflaming racial tensions inside South Africa while exporting those tensions into the global arena. More troubling still, analysts in Europe and Asia recognized something even more dangerous. A U.S. president was now willing to weaponize racial narratives as instruments of foreign policy. Once diplomacy shifted from evidence to emotion, from data to identity, institutions stopped mediating disputes and began amplifying them. This marked a profound shift in America's posture toward the global South. Moral judgment first, multilateral cooperation second. South Africa did not respond with silence or restraint. It responded with defiance. Within hours, Pretoria delivered a message aimed not at Washington, but at the world itself. If South Africa is excluded, the G20 loses its legitimacy. This was not rhetorical bravado. It was strategic calculation. South Africa understands its position at the crossroads of the African Union, BRICS, and the non-aligned movement. It knows how many nations see their own vulnerabilities reflected in its treatment. Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor dismissed Trump's accusations as fabricated, reckless, and racially inflammatory. But the true shock came next. Several countries, she revealed, were prepared to boycott the 2026 G20 summit if South Africa were pushed out. In a single stroke, Pretoria flipped the narrative. What began as Washington punishing an alleged human rights offender suddenly became a global backlash against American overreach. Rather than pause, Washington escalated. U.S. foreign aid to South Africa was suspended, diplomatic pressure intensified. Then came an unprecedented move, the expulsion of South Africa's ambassador. In diplomatic terms, ambassador expulsions are not symbolic gestures, a signal that a relationship has reached a breaking point without open conflict. The final rupture came during the now infamous Oval Office confrontation in May. President Ramaphosa arrived seeking stability. Trump arrived demanding validation. From the opening moments, the meeting was adversarial. Trump framed allegations of violence against white farmers as a moral litmus test. Ramaphosa refused to accept that framing. According to officials familiar with the exchange, the clash was so fundamental that diplomacy itself became impossible. There was no agreement, no joint statement, no symbolic handshake. Both leaders left the room facing opposite directions, politically and symbolically. By that moment, the truth was unavoidable. The U.S.-South Africa rift was no longer about land, reform, or human rights narratives. It had become a battle over whether global institutions would be governed by consensus or by coercion. For 2 decades, the G20 survived because membership was unconditional. It was never meant to be a club of the obedient. It was designed to include rivals, adversaries, and ideological opposites. And that inclusivity was its stabilizing force. Trump's decision did not merely bend this principle, it annihilated it. Once participation becomes conditional, institutions collapse from within, and that is why fear spread so rapidly across capitals. If South Africa can be removed today, who will be removed tomorrow? This fear is not paranoia. It is geopolitical logic. It explains why murmurs of solidarity emerged from Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and key African states, and why Beijing and New Delhi interpreted the move as a test case for broader U.S. dominance over global institutions. This crisis may ultimately be remembered as the moment a quiet truth became impossible to ignore. A global institution cannot survive once it becomes a weapon. When great powers abandon restraint, systems fracture. Trump's expulsion of South Africa was not an isolated incident. It was a signal that the post-Cold War economic order is cracking. Beijing sees opportunity. Moscow sees vindication. The global South sees warning. And from that warning emerges a parallel future. The rise of BRICS Plus and alternative institutions built to escape conditional governance. If history remembers this moment, it will not be for the accusations that triggered it, but for what it unleashed, the beginning of a world divided into rival economic civilizations, staring across a divide they may no longer be able to bridge.